My name is Karen Scurry, and I'm with Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety. Let me first start by saying that, when we first launched the CMF Clearinghouse, our goal was to provide you with a couple of things. A regularly updated online repository of crash modification factors, a mechanism for sharing newly developed crash modification factors. So if you're doing any independent research, you can submit those up through the CMF Clearinghouse. And then another goal of ours was to provide educational information on the proper application of CMFs. And that last goal is really what brings us all together today, with a focus on real-world safety and specifically the benefits of using crash modification factors to predict and prioritize. So we're scheduled to go until about 4 p.m. Eastern Time today, and we'll try our best to stick to that schedule. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and we plan to post that recording back out to the CMF Clearinghouse within the next week or so. I also want you to note that all the lines are muted during today's webinar. We had about 250 registrations, and so with that large of an audience, it is very difficult to control the lines if they're not muted. So muting your phone allows us to cut down on confusion and background noise, and of course that awful threaded hold music. So before we get started with today's webinar, I wanted to go over a few administrative details and some information about the functionality of the webinar software. So as an attendee, you have a control panel in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking on the red arrow. And so that red arrow is towards the left side of that panel. I'll also point out that the little X in the top right corner of that panel will exit you from the webinar room, but that's okay. If that happens, you can just log right back in. No worries there. And at the bottom of that control panel, you'll see it's a chat box. And so though you will be muted, you do have the ability to ask questions by entering them in that chat box. And that's, again, located at the bottom of that control panel. If you have any problems during the webinar, you can also chat with us here in this box, and we'll monitor those questions and respond to you if we're able to. I would encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar today. We are going to hold all questions until the end of the webinar. That way we can make sure we get all of the presentations in. But you can type your questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll answer those questions at the end of all the presentations. So for this reason, I would ask that you try to be as specific as possible when asking your question. So for example, instead of entering a question very generally like, what does that 2 mean, when we're on a specific slide, if you could instead say something like, hey Frank, what does that 2 mean on slide 3, or reference the title of his slide or something like that. And you'll note also that I used Frank's name with that question, so it would help us to direct the questions at the end of the webinar if you could do that too. So if for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, or you hit that X in the right corner of your control panel like I mentioned and have done on occasion before, just reload the website and log back into the program, and you'll be able to rejoin the session. Just 2 more housekeeping items, and I'll again remind you of these at the end of the webinar today. But when you exit the webinar, a brief survey will load. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance today. We use this feedback. As I said, this is our annual CMF Clearinghouse webinar, so we do this once a year, and the information that you provide helps us tailor and improve on future webinars. And then following today's webinar, you'll also receive a follow-up email from the CMF Clearinghouse. This email will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of professional development instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, you can just forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. And so I think that's all the housekeeping items, and so we can move to the agenda. We have a very exciting agenda planned for you today, starting with Daniel Carter at the Highway Safety Research Center at the University of North Carolina. Many of you know Daniel as the CMF Clearinghouse Manager. He manages the daily activities of the CMF Clearinghouse, and so he will provide us an update on some of the recent activities and then current and upcoming features related to the CMF Clearinghouse. And I mentioned how we use that feedback you provide at the end of the webinar. In previous webinars, you all have expressed a lot of interest about the use of crash modification factors in crash prediction models, and so we've asked Dr. Frank Gross with VHB to provide some information about that. And then we also like to share some practical applications during these webinars, and so we've asked Stephen Reed with Virginia DOT to join us and talk a little bit about how they're using CMFs in planning applications. And then we'll also hear from Mike McNeil with Ohio DOT on how they're using CMFs in benefit cost analysis and project prioritization. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll hold all questions until the end of the webinar, but you are, of course, welcome to submit questions at any time in that chat box on your control panel. And so before I go ahead and turn it over to Daniel, we have a real quick poll question for you. And we're just trying to gauge the number of people who are attending the webinar today. So if you could indicate how many people are in your location. I see that we have about 235 attendees online, but I know that sometimes it's more than just one person sitting at your site. So if you could just let us know if it's just you. Maybe there are 2 to 3 participants at your site, 4 to 5, 6 to 7, or maybe you've gathered the whole office and are sitting around listening to the presentations today. I'm not sure what happened, but the poll left my screen, Caroline.
Yeah, we had about 80% people respond, so we went ahead and closed it.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you for your attention, and I'll now turn it over to Daniel Carter.
All right, great, thank you, Karen. So yeah, I'd like to cover here in the next few minutes some of the current features of the Clearinghouse, recently added features, and some upcoming things. I just want to cover some various topics I think could be useful for you to know as a Clearinghouse user. So I'll talk a little bit about the star quality rating. Certainly that's a very visible piece of what we've got available on the Clearinghouse, and a little bit about what goes into that. We'll look at searching using the filters. Some of you might be familiar with the filtering feature, and I'll talk through some recently added features and one upcoming one. So the star quality rating is something we've used as part of the Clearinghouse since the launch at the end of 2009. It's a way of indicating the quality or reliability of each of the CMFs that we post on there. And some of you might know that we base this on a 5-criterion list, and I've shown it there. I just wanted to talk about each one of those a little bit to maybe inform you a little bit about what goes into the star quality rating that you see when you search for CMFs. So the first criterion that we look at is the study design, which is the methodology used by the authors of the study. And so for each of these, we have an excellent, fair, or poor rating for each of these criteria we'll talk about. So for study design, an excellent study design would be one that is statistically rigorous, using a reference group, or it's a randomized experiment in control. So I have to say that's fairly rare in the transportation field that we get the chance to do a really randomized experiment. But that would be an excellent study design. Will account for a lot of biases and this sort of thing. A fair rating is such as we give to a cross-sectional type of study where you're looking at sites that have a particular feature or safety treatment versus those that don't, or any kind of coefficient-based regression type analysis lands in that fair rating. Generally thought to be a good technique, but not as good as a very rigorous before and after type of design. And then the poor rating would go to something like a simple before and after. So simply looking at the crash numbers before and after treatment and involving no other data. So not able to account for as many biases and this sort of thing. The second criteria is sample size, and this is just reflecting what was the data used to develop the CMF, and this could be the number of crashes that were used, mile years, site years, miles, or sites mainly being intersections in this case. And just FYI, a mile year is if you had 8 miles in your study and you studied it for 5 years, you have 40 mile years. So it depends on how the authors report the study details as to what they used. But we look at that to see what is the sample size, and just, of course, larger is better. And the exact rating depends on the size of the sample with some considerations in there for what type of study design was being used. The third one is the standard error, which is a statistical indication of the reliability of the CMF value itself, so numerical value here. And it depends on, this one, the rating depends on the significance level. So if the CMF is significant at a high confidence level of 95%, and the example there shows a CMF of 0.8, so some decent reduction to whatever that countermeasure the CMF is referring to, 0.8 there. If the standard error is 0.05, that's a pretty low standard error, and that CMF is significant at a 95% level, so that would get an excellent rating. Fair rating would go to those CMFs that are significant at 90% but not at 95%. So if you have that same CMF of 0.8, but the standard error is now higher at 0.11, that would land in the fair rating. And then a poor rating would be those that aren't even significant at a 90% level. So if you have that 0.8 CMF, standard error of 0.2 or anything greater than that would be not significant at that level. Potential bias is the fourth criterion. This is a bit more of a wide open category in terms of looking at any biases that were observed by our review team here. So this could be anything from the makeup of the group of sites that were used for the study to issues with the analysis or the modeling, anything like that. And just in general, if there are biases noted, it brings down the rating here, so it's a better rating for fewer biases. And the last one is data source, and it really deals with the diversity of the data used to develop the CMFs. And basically, the more diverse the data, the better the rating. So excellent rating would be diversity of multiple states with different geographies, so kind of representing a lot of different types of conditions, basically leading to a CMF that can be more widely applied. Fair would be if the CMF was developed using sites within just one state, but throughout different areas of the state, perhaps so California, but from the north and the south parts and all over. Whereas the poor rating here would be just, let's say, one town in one state, one city in one state, so limited diversity there. For most of the CMFs on the clearinghouse, if you pull up the details page, you can click on that link that says View Score Details, and it'll pop up a window that will tell you what is the breakdown for each of these 5 criteria for that particular CMF. So we see this one here, and it's 4 stars, and we can look up there and see which aspects of it were got the higher ratings and this kind of thing. So that's there for your information if you want to look at that. All right, wanted to talk about another feature that we've had on the clearinghouse for a little while now, a couple years at this point, using the filters. And at this point, I'm going to actually switch over to the web browser to show you this. I really love it if we cooperate. Yeah. All right. So for example, if you were to do a search and you're looking at installing a traffic signal, so you're going to search on the clearinghouse, and of course we search by the countermeasure name, and I'm going to use the fewest keywords possible to give me a fairly wide set of results. All right, so you can see that we've got 581 CMFs returned for that search, so a pretty large stack of CMFs. Because this is going to involve anything that has a keyword that involves signal, which also could be something like signalized. Anything like that that involves those 6 letters essentially is going to come up in this search. So then we can use the filters to bring that down somewhat. So we can, let's say, I might be interested only in CMFs that are 3, 4, 5 stars. Because I have such a large stack, I can filter down and just look at those higher rated star CMFs. So click on those and click filter, and now it brings the total to 389. Okay, so we've whittled that down some. You know, going farther down, I might be interested in only angle crashes, bringing down angle crashes at the particular intersection, so I can go under crash type and select angle crash and do another filtering. So I can come down here and click on filter results. So that brings the set of results down a pretty good bit. I'm left with 38 CMFs now, and these are, of course, CMFs that are for angle crashes and are also 3, 4, or 5 star rated. But perhaps I'm in an urban area. I know that the site of interest is an urban area, and so I'm going to go down here and look under the area type filter. I'm going to expand that And I can see that of these 38 or so CMFs, there are some that are directly related just for urban, a couple for urban and suburban, 3 for rural. So since I'm in an urban area, I'm going to click on urban and filter the results one more time. And now I've got a set of 24 CMFs that are more closely related to my scenario, my site conditions that I'm looking at. You'll see I've still got CMFs in 3 categories coming up here. So under access management, if I were to look at that, well, that's got some CMFs related to signal spacing, kind of more of a broad level type of countermeasures. Under advanced technology and ITS, there's one related to red light cameras, so dealing with signals, and that's why I came up in this search, but not what I'm looking at. I wanted to look at installing a traffic signal. So under intersection traffic control, I've got ones under the traffic control type. So some ones related to spacing and converting from one type to another, and in fact there is what I was looking for, installing a traffic signal. Signal phasing and timing, there's one related to replacing a nighttime flash with a steady operation. So phasing change there, not what I'm looking for, but anyways, this gives you an example of how you can use filters then to bring down the list of CMFs to more specifically what you're looking for in your scenario. Now I'm going to do another search, and this time I'll be interested in rumble strips. So again, using a term that's related to the countermeasure of interest, which is rumble strips. I'm just going to use rumble, using the fewest terms, give you a little bit of a broad set of results here. And just for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I'm going to trim down that set of CMFs. That's a pretty large stack. I'm going to trim it down just a little bit for discussion. So I'm going to say that I'm interested only in runoff road crashes, or excuse me, runoff road focused CMFs. And also I'm interested only in fatal and injury crash reductions. And so I'm going to select from the fatal, the serious injury, and the minor injury categories. I'm going to filter for all of that. Now, it could be the case that if I had applied too many filters, I could have actually set up a condition where there were no CMFs that met that condition. If you get a 0 result, that's why. But in this case, I still have 125 CMFs in the search that do meet those criteria. So I'm going to drill down. I'm going to go ahead and drill down here through the shoulder treatments category, shoulder rumble strips, and I'm just going to expand this one here at the top. So let me see if I can enlarge this a little bit. We have a set of results, CMFs dealing with shoulder rumble strips. And you can see some of the details that you can see right here on the screen as far as the crash type and severity and the area type. Now, if we look at these first 2 results, though, we can tell that the values are different, 0.83 and 0.64. But they have the same star rating, they have the same crash type, severity, area type, so they look identical here. So the key here is to look at the details that underlie. There's a lot more data for each of these CMFs than what's shown here. If you click on the CMF value itself, it brings up the details page, and there's a lot more about how this particular CMF was developed, what type of sites were used. So this can be a real key when you're trying to decide between 2 CMFs that seem identical. At this point, I'm actually going to switch back over to my presentation because I've got a better visualization of that for you over here. So if we take these details pages for each of these 2 CMFs we looked at, the top 2, the 0.64 and the 0.83, and we start examining some of these details, we can see pretty quickly why they're different or some of the things that make them different. So, for example, the roadway type and number of lanes and the road division all together, we can look at the 2 of them. We can see the one on the left deals with undivided 2-lane roads, whereas the one on the right deals with divided freeways and expressways. So fairly different roadway types there. Even just a few lines down, we can see under the traffic volume that the one on the left deals with a much lower range of traffic volume AADT, a maximum of about 10,000, as opposed to the one on the right with a maximum of about 37,000. So differences that emerge when we look at the details. And in fact, if we went on down the page, we would see yet another difference, which is the one on the left was developed with data from Minnesota, Missouri, and Pennsylvania, whereas the one on the right was using only data from Missouri and Pennsylvania. Now, of all these differences, I think the biggest one there is the road difference, the road type difference, the 2-lane undivided versus the freeway, of course. But just an example to show you some of the differences that you can see when you look at the details and how that can be important sometimes. and actually put a mental bookmark there. I'll come back to that in just a minute. I wanted to mention a few other features that we've got on the CMF Clearinghouse, a few recently added. And so we've got a reorganized navigation, and I'll look at that in just a second. We've added a user guide for new users or just those who don't have as much experience. A resource that I want to point out will be the state CMF lists, and then I'll mention an upcoming tool we've got. If you'll pardon me, I'm going to go back over to the website to show you some of these. Okay, so on the front page of the Clearinghouse, some of you may have noticed that across the top the navigation bar has been restructured, really trying to group the resources that we're offering in terms of the different ways in which you use CMFs. So the first one there has a pull down, and it has everything about the Clearinghouse itself. I'll come back to that in a second. Next to that is a group of resources for using CMFs, and so guidance documents related to applying CMFs. There's links for trainings on that topic. The third one there is for developing CMFs, and this would be for primarily for the researcher crowd who are conducting studies to develop CMFs, and so we've got guidance there related to methodologies for developing CMFs, what data are needed, what are the protocols for reporting when you're authoring a study, as well as resources there about CMF needs for future studies. The last one we've got listed there is additional resources. So this is a lot of other types of resources that may assist you in the way that you're using CMFs in your job, whether you're doing benefit cost analysis, like we'll hear from Mike in a little bit. But one of the things I want to point out here is recently added, and it's the state-selected CMF lists. If you click on that, you can see that what we've done is provided links to, or in some cases hosting the files for, various states that have gone through the Clearinghouse to decide which of the CMFs in the Clearinghouse they're going to use in their state, so kind of their selected list of CMFs. And so if you want, you can go check that out, see what CMFs Colorado's using, which ones New York is using, this kind of thing. And some of them, we've got some contact information if you've got questions related to that. Now the first area here in the upper navigation bar I pulled down, I want to mention that the first listed item there is the user guide, and this is a newly developed feature we've got that you might be interested in if you don't have as much experience using the Clearinghouse, or if you're dealing with others in your agency who want to be introduced to it. We've designed this to be an easy-to-follow guide that talks very generally first about crash modification factors, what they are, how you use them. We do an intro to the Clearinghouse to say, what does this have? And then we have sections on some of the basic actions that you'd be doing on the Clearinghouse, how to search, how to identify what CMF to use. As a part of doing this, we also embedded videos throughout here to just illustrate in a visual sense. You can actually watch a search being conducted on the Clearinghouse and talking through the aspects of what you see when you do that. So please make use of that and check that out, and that could be helpful to you or others. Now, for the last thing I wanted to mention, I don't have a visual for it because it's a tool we're still working on, but I'll go back just a few slides to this idea where we are comparing CMFs that seemed identical. And so what we're doing is right now working on a tool to do just this, to bring up CMFs in a side-by-side fashion so you can see 2, 3, 4 CMFs in a side-by-side manner to see where do they differ. Is it in the roadway type? Is it in the volume range or the state or what have you? So that's something that we're in process of and look to get it operational in early 2016. So be on the lookout for that. Yeah, okay. Well, as Caroline is changing control over to Frank Gross, I'll just go ahead and introduce Frank, who is a member of our CMF Clearinghouse team. And as Karen said, there was a lot of interest in crash prediction models and the use of CMFs in those. And so we're going to hear from Dr. Frank Gross now.
All right, thanks, Daniel. How does everything look?
Yep, we can see your screen.
All right, terrific. All right, welcome everyone. And I just hit my afternoon lull, so how about a little bit of acronym soup to get us started? I've been told that a large dose of acronyms is even better than coffee for that afternoon lull, so let's give it a try. So CMFs in CPMs or SPFs. And just to clarify, CPM stands for Crash Prediction Model, and SPF stands for Safety Performance Function. I think we're all familiar with the term CMF by now, but CPMs and SPFs are really the same thing. They're equations that provide us a method for predicting crashes based on traffic volumes and perhaps other site characteristics. So what we're really talking about is CMFs and the predictive method. Just a quick look at where we're going today. I'll start with a brief overview of the predictive method, which is Part C of the Highway Safety Manual, and then I'll provide another quick overview of Part D of the Highway Safety Manual, which is individual CMFs. And then I'll wrap up by pulling this all together and providing a little bit more of a detailed discussion on how to use CMFs from Part D or from the CMF Clearinghouse with the Part C predictive method. So what is the predictive method? Well, the predictive method is a way to quantify the safety performance of a given site or facility or network. So using this method, you can predict crashes and account for specific site characteristics such as roadside conditions, traffic control, and traffic volume. So the first equation is an example, it's a very simple example of a safety performance function from the Highway Safety Manual, and this SPF represents the equation for rural two-lane undivided roads. So the predicted crashes, N, on the left-hand side of the equation, is a function of segment length L, traffic volume, which is AADT in this case, and then the remainder of the equation, which is all multipliers. So that was a very simple example. Here's a little bit more of a complex SPF. Some people might call it a crash prediction model, in that it includes other variables. So in this case, you have additional variables beyond traffic volume to account for the number of nearby driveways and the intersection skew angle. So this SPF is related to intersections. So the purpose of the predictive method, as I mentioned, is really to help consider safety performance in the decision-making process. And it provides an opportunity to, one, quantify the safety performance, either of an existing or a proposed facility. You could also compare the safety performance of various design alternatives. You can use the predictive method in evaluating the safety effectiveness of projects. And as I'll discuss a little later, you can use this method to help justify design exceptions based on safety impacts. The photos at the bottom of this slide represent a before and after condition for an actual project that was implemented. And the planners and designers of this project could have used the predictive method to estimate the safety performance under these two conditions before making any final decisions. So ultimately, they decided to convert the 4-lane undivided facility on the left to a 2-lane median divided facility that's shown on the right. And the predictive method can help you estimate what the crashes would be under those two scenarios. All right, so that was a real brief introduction to the predictive method, and I think most of us are familiar with CMFs in general, but just as a real quick overview, CMFs provide a quantitative method to estimate the change in safety performance when you have a change in site conditions. So the example on this slide shows CMFs from the Highway Safety Manual related to median width. And in this case, the baseline condition with a CMF of 1 is a median width of 15 feet, and the other CMFs show what would happen if you were to decrease the median width to 10 feet or increase the median width from 20 to 25 to 30 feet. You can see what the percent reduction in target crashes would be. So again, the purpose of CMFs is really to estimate the change in crashes as a result of some potential treatment. So another example is to determine the effect of adding chevrons on a rural horizontal curve. And I think and most of us are fairly familiar with this process. So how are CMFs integrated or used in the predictive method? They're primarily used to adjust the base predicted crash frequency from SPFs. So SPFs give you some predicted number for a set of base conditions. And if the location of interest differs from those base conditions, then you need to adjust that prediction to the conditions of interest. So there's two primary ways to adjust that prediction, and this is an important distinction and really kind of the underlying point of this presentation. So the first opportunity is to use CMFs from Part C of the Highway Safety Manual, and I like to call these adjustment factors because they're only applicable to the related SPF in Part C, and they're used to adjust the prediction when the conditions differ from the baseline. So I'll show an example of this in a moment, but the table on the right shows the base conditions for rural two-lane roads from the Highway Safety Manual. So if your conditions of interest differ from these base conditions, then you need to apply an appropriate adjustment factor from Part C to adjust to your conditions of interest. The second way you could apply CMFs to the predictive method is to use CMFs from Part D or from the CMF Clearinghouse or another source. So these CMFs can be used to account for conditions that are not represented in the SPF or are not represented in the base conditions, such as in the table shown on the right. So again, I'll show an example of this as well, but you can see if you look quickly in this table, there's no condition for shoulder rumble strips. So there is for centerline rumble strips, but there's no adjustment factors in Part C for shoulder rumble strips. So if you wanted to look at shoulder rumble strips, you would have to find a CMF either from Part D, the CMF Clearinghouse, or another source. So here's an example, a very simple example using the Part C predictive method with some basic adjustment factors. So in this example, a design engineer wants to calculate the predicted safety performance of a 1-mile section of rural two-lane road with a traffic volume of 6,000 vehicles per day. So the first step is to identify a suitable SPF and the associated base conditions. So in this case, the SPF is given from the Highway Safety Manual, and the base conditions are shown in the table on the right, along with the proposed conditions. The predicted crashes is calculated by simply plugging in the traffic volume and segment length of 6,000 vehicles per day in 1 mile, and that results in 1.6 predicted crashes per year. Now that is for this set of base conditions, 12-foot lanes, 6-foot paved shoulders, and so on. Now the condition of interest differs. So the designer is interested in 11-foot lanes and 2-foot shoulders. So we need to identify and apply adjustment factors from Part C of the HSM. So the two tables on this slide are directly from Part C of the Highway Safety Manual, and they provide adjustment factors for lane and shoulder width for rural two-lane roads. So they're directly applicable to our SPF and those base conditions. So given that our roadway has 6,000 vehicles per day, we're looking in the last column, and that provides adjustment factors of 1.05 and 1.3 for the lane and shoulder width respectively. So we're looking at an 11-foot lane, which would suggest a 5% increase in crashes compared to the base condition of a 12-foot lane. And we think that we want to have a 2-foot shoulder, which would indicate a 30% increase in these target crashes compared to the base condition of 6-foot shoulders. So taking those adjustment factors, we can apply those directly to our base prediction. So our base prediction was 1.6 crashes per year. We multiply that by 1.05 and again by 1.3 and estimate 2.2 crashes per year for the conditions of interest. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail on the adjustment factors in these tables, but I will make a quick note that these are related to specific crash types. So what we've been predicting is total crashes. And these adjustment factors are really for specific crash types, which are runoff road, head-on, and sideswipe crashes. So if we assume that our total crashes only includes those run-off road, head-on, and sideswipe crashes, we're okay. We can use these adjustment factors as is. If your roadway has other types of crashes, then there's another quick adjustment to modify these adjustment factors. But I won't go into detail on that right now. So that covers simple adjustments from the Part C predictive method using the Part C adjustment factors. So now let's briefly review how to apply CMFs from Part D of the HSM for another condition. So I'll use another example. In this case, a traffic engineer wants to estimate the potential safety effect of installing a traffic signal at a rural stop-controlled intersection. Let's assume there were 50 crashes over a 10-year period, which is an average of 5 crashes per year, and the CMF for this treatment is 0.56, and that applies to total crashes. So applying the CMF of 0.56 to the 5 crashes per year without treatment, we estimate 2.8 crashes per year with treatment. And this is equivalent to a reduction of 2.2 crashes per year if we subtract the crashes with treatment from the crashes without treatment. So one note here, this is a very simple example, and I used the average crashes per year without treatment to estimate what we would expect if we didn't install a traffic signal. You could use the predictive method to do the same thing. So you could use an SPF to predict what would happen with the given traffic volumes if you were to remain under the stop control condition. And that would help to improve the reliability of the results. All right, so now let's pull it all together. So going back to the first example, let's assume the designer is considering shoulder rumble strips to address a known issue with runoff road crashes. If we review that table on the right again, there are no base conditions or adjustment factors in Part C for shoulder rumble strips. So in this case, you're going to need to pull a CMF from Part D or from the CMF Clearinghouse or another source. So in this case, Part D does not contain any CMFs for shoulder rumble strips for 2-lane rural roads either. So I went to the CMF Clearinghouse, and as Daniel showed, there are hundreds of CMFs for installing shoulder rumble strips there. And I was able to narrow this down to CMFs with 4 or more stars for rural 2-lane roads that apply to total crashes. So I used the filters, and I got down to 4 CMFs, and I still have 4 choices, and the one difference here is the state that they were developed from. So in this case, let's assume that we're considering a roadway in New York, and the designer determined that the CMF from Pennsylvania was most applicable. So we're going to use the CMF of 0.76 for adjusting the predicted crashes even further. So previously, we estimated the predicted crashes per year for base conditions using an SPF from Part C of the Highway Safety Manual. So that was base conditions with 12-foot lanes and 6-foot shoulders. We were interested in a roadway with 11-foot lanes and 2-foot shoulders, so we applied adjustment factors from Part C. And then finally, we can apply the CMF of 0.76 to this last prediction to estimate the number of crashes per year with 11-foot lanes, 2-foot shoulders, and shoulder rumble strips. So you can see how this would be useful in the decision-making process, and more specifically in the design exception process, as I listed earlier. So for example, if you're considering a design exception, maybe the design standard calls for a 12-foot lane and 6-foot shoulder, but existing conditions may limit your cross-section to 11-foot lanes with 2-foot shoulders. So you're able to see first how your initial proposed design exception compares to the design standard using the predicted crashes. And then you could justify mitigation measures saying, well, to mitigate the potential adverse impact of reducing the lane and shoulder width, we're going to apply or install shoulder rumble strips, and now our predicted crashes are fairly close to what the predicted crashes would be for the design standards. So that's kind of in a nutshell integrating the Part D CMFs or CMFs from the clearinghouse into the predictive method. So just to wrap up, let's talk about a few do's and don'ts. So the first one is, do apply Part C adjustment factors to the applicable SPFs from Part C of the Highway Safety Manual. Do not, on the right-hand side, apply those Part C adjustment factors to other SPFs or to observed crashes if you're using observed crash history. So the Part C adjustment factors are specific to the Part C SPFs. If you're using Part D of the Highway Safety Manual, you can go ahead and apply those to either the predicted crashes, as I've showed in the example, or to your average observed crash history, as long as your CMFs apply to your given scenario, scenario of interest. Excuse me. So the don't with the Part D CMFs is don't apply those Part D CMFs to inapplicable scenarios. So for example, don't apply a CMF for total crashes to estimate the change in runoff road crashes. Similarly, you should not apply a CMF for an urban 4-lane divided facility to a rural 2-lane road. So those are some of the do's and don'ts. And Daniel was thinking that we might want to make up a t-shirt and start wearing these around to remind everybody, and I thought that was a pretty good idea. So with that thought, I'll turn it back over and pass it on to Stephen.
Thanks, Frank. And yeah, we're all about the marketing here in the clearinghouse, so make some swag to hand out here. Well, our next presenter is Stephen Reed from Virginia. And Stephen, I think you probably have the opportunity to take screen control. Yep, there we go. We see your screen. So welcome, Stephen Reed.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. This afternoon I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about how we're using CMFs in the planning environment. My role here at VDOT is with the Highway Safety Improvement Program. I'm the planning manager dealing with all of the planning initiatives under safety. And so specifically in terms of applications, we're looking at using CMFs for project prioritization of Virginia state funded projects. The outline for my presentation spends the first 2 sections giving you some background as to why we're getting involved with this. As one of the first in the nation, I know North Carolina has done some work in this area as well. And then we'll get right into the meat of the discussion on how we developed our CMFs at the planning level and then applied those for some specific uses of project types that were submitted with our application. So first of all, background on how this all evolved, starting with some legislation. For years, we have been developing long-range plans called VTRAN, which is a planning document that looks at capacity, congestion, multimodalism, and so on. 2 years ago, a House bill was passed that essentially required us to look at prioritizing projects based on a multimodal approach with multiple factors involved with scoring, screening, and prioritizing those projects. A sister bill was passed that changed our funding allocations that in the past were split between our construction districts and now have been split into 2 parcels or categories of funds that I'll talk about here in a few slides. Under the bill, the funding was identified for what are called high priority or regional projects and those that are more of a local priority that are within a construction district. And so to identify what was being scored and prioritized on a statewide basis, we're looking at construction projects and operational projects that are either on a corridor of statewide significance, which are designated by our Commonwealth Transportation Board as being multimodal corridors that you see in blue here on this map. They are essentially a subset of our national highway system, our interstates, parallel primary roads, railroads in those corridors. If there isn't an interstate, it's just a primary road like you see across the bottom of the Commonwealth is US 58. Also is regional networks, and those are the pink or salmon-colored areas that are metropolitan statistical areas that make up our MPOs, and so projects within those networks can be applied for statewide funding. To apply for the other 50% of the funds that was apportioned to our 9 construction districts, you could look at a project at either of those 2 other networks, or in these small areas that have been locally identified and designated through a board of resolution as a development area, or in the blue areas out in the more rural parts of the state. Localities could apply for a safety-only type project. So what are our factors that we're using with this overall process? And you can see safety I've put at the top as my primary concern, but there's also a congestion mitigation, which we're looking at increase in person throughput and decrease in travel time in the corridor for that improvement. There's accessibility measures, which involve some multimodal factors. There's environmental quality, economic development in terms of parcels that are served that are undeveloped at this point in time, as well as land use for those areas that are in the larger MPOs, those with over 200,000 residents. So although I put safety first, it is not the top factor by any means. The state was divided up into what we're calling typologies, into different categories based on essentially land use density. And so you can see what we call our urban crescent of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton roads, our higher level categories A and B, and the rest of the state more or less are categories C and D. And so safety has a different factor and different priority in each of those different areas. And so the value ranging from 5% in the more urbanized areas up to 30% of the total score in the more rural areas of the Commonwealth. For safety measures, we are looking at 2 distinct measures, and that is the reduction in total fatalities and severe, or some called serious injuries, or 50% of the score being related to the rate of those fatal and severe injuries per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. You can see there for transit projects, only the score of reduction in those severe crashes is going to occur. But today I'm only going to be talking about highway and bicycle and pedestrian type projects that are involved with an existing roadway alignment. So, knowing that we couldn't go through the whole process of looking at what Frank described quite nicely for Part C and D, frankly not knowing how many projects we were going to receive, we knew we had to develop a planning level application of CMFs. And so we began last winter to look at this process, actually working with Dr. Gross and with Daniel to develop these planning level CMFs for our applied projects. In fact, we had over 300 projects submitted, and so I'll walk you through at the end of the presentation how an example of how we applied these CMFs for those projects. So first of all, what we needed to do from a planning level was determine what are the project extents that we would expect to see. What are the project limits, if you will, and what types of projects would we expect to see submitted. And so we defined these 5 project extents or project types, understanding that in the end that bridges most bridge projects are essentially a segment project or involved with an interchange, but primarily a widening type project which would fall into the segment. So for example, let's walk through intersections here with what we did to develop these CMFs. First of all, we knew that there were multiple treatments, if you will, or improvement types that we would expect to see for an intersection. And you can see those listed there that we thought that would be the fundamental types that we would see submitted for this funding source. The first step that we needed to do was to determine what were those applicable CMFs. And so, as Daniel was presenting, we were able to filter the clearinghouse database and determine down to those CMFs that we thought would be applicable. So for that first one that we have in the list before, new signal, we knew we could filter to that. And then we could look at the database to determine which CMFs were applicable. So those higher star quality ones, we knew that we wanted to look at all crash types, not wanting to filter our crash database for specific targeted crashes for each individual improvement at the planning level, not necessarily being able to define that. And then we also wanted to look at those that had crash severity that looked at fatal and injury consequences to those crashes. So we were able to filter the data quite nicely for these and define the range that were there. So as Frank mentioned, there's quite a range for any individual improvement type, even after filtering for those attributes that we were interested in. And so you can see here that we found from the data that there was a maximum and minimum available across those multiple published CMFs, and we used that to develop averages, medians, and the standard deviation of those CMFs. And from that information, we were able to look at the range that we would expect, as well as what was typical or average. And so in this case, you can see that the average and the median are close. The standard deviation is reasonable, and so we decided to pick close to the average planning level CMF for all new signals, regardless of where they are across the state. For some improvement categories, we needed to look at a range or a combination of countermeasures. So, for example, not really knowing at the planning level what access management may be proposed, just that they may be looking at multiple treatments further on in the project development process. We knew there were several access management related type improvements, as an example, as you see listed here, with the max, min, average, median, and standard deviation that we looked at. And we had to make a decision of what was a reasonable one that we would expect to use for either a combination or one of these in particular that may be called out from the applicant itself. However, even with all of those, there were many improvement types that we knew were not addressed at the planning level from the clearinghouse. For example, large widening projects, interchange type projects, and other similar roadway improvements that are larger in extent, if you will. And so we decided that we needed to look through multiple sources there, and primarily looking at the bottom two here in terms of these bullets, and that is our VDOT developed safety performance functions that we have for implementing Part B of the safety manual, as well as our crash rate and the ratio of our crash rates. So primarily, those two sources were used for our larger widening type projects and interchange type projects. And specifically, we first looked at our safety performance functions, which we had developed for all the site subtypes that you'll see in Part B and that are implemented through Safety Analyst AASHTOWare. And so in this case, we were looking at SPFs, for example, of widening a rural freeway from 2 to 3 lanes in each direction. And because those are functions based on AADT, we could look at the minimum, maximum, and average values. And in the end, we would pick a number close to that average and more in the range of where what typical volumes you would expect to widen a facility from 2 to 3 lanes based on the volume to capacity ratio. However, in some cases, that value was approaching 1 or greater than 1, particularly in the urban areas. And so we decided to look at our Virginia crash rate, our Virginia crash database and crash rates, which we developed statewide, multiple year average volumes based on federal functional classification and number of lanes. And so based on that, we could look at the ratio of those crash rates going from, for example, rural 2-lane or urban 4-lane to 6-lane, as there is in this example, and look at the ratio of those ranges as well over the different functional classes that we have our roadway inventory categorized as. And so in this case, we saw a range. We could look at the standard error of that and look at a CMF that looked applicable compared to other CMFs, for example, of going to from 4 to 8 lanes or from 2 to 3 lanes, so that the CMFs were consistent across all of those improvement types. So where did we end up? We ended up with a list of about 50 different CMFs. Those are available on the House Bill 2 website. I'm going to walk you through a few of those quickly and then give you an example. So here's a listing of the intersection CMFs that were found and documented. And so you can see that, again, these are for fatal and injury type crashes, severe injury crashes in our case. And you can see the range of CMFs there from the very best roundabout to adding turn lanes with a very small reduction, a 3% reduction, resulting in a CMF of 0.97. Here's the range of interchange type CMFs. These are being applied for those improvements that are called out segment by segment within an interchange. And we're also looking at the range of volume reductions given different interchange improvements of removing ramps or adding ramps as well. So we are looking at that. And in fact, during the process, it's not listed here, we had to develop a CMF for adding lanes to exit and entrance ramps. But that has not been published yet. For highway segments, they're broken into non-freeway versus freeway. So here's the listing for non-freeway, which includes operational improvements at the top as well as reconstruction, which looks at a range of roadside and roadway alignment type improvements, CMFs, all the way through to those that we used SPFs and our crash rate to determine planning level CMFs. Here are the freeway improvements, again with operational at the top, and those widening projects, type projects at the bottom. The most interesting one was that because it is a multimodal approach, that we needed to come up with surrogates for bicycle and pedestrian type projects. And so most of the CMFs that you will see published are only involve those pedestrian or bicycle crashes. or bike-to-ped crashes for some of the work out of Europe. And so for our case, we actually looked at a surrogate of what that improvement would do to the cross-section, and started to look at shoulder width, clear zone, and distance to fixed objects as surrogates for adding these type linear improvements that you see at the top here, as well as at-grade crossings. There are some CMFs available for that that we included as well. And then you can see at the bottom, to wrap it up, the bridges are essentially like a segment type project. So let's roll through an example here of how we applied these CMFs. The first step of what we needed to do was what we call segmenting the project to apply an appropriate CMF and the appropriate crashes for a given section of roadway. And so you can see here in the fuchsia, we had a roadway which was being widened to a super street type cross-section for most of the length. However, at the very end of it, there was a major intersection upgrade that you can see the segment that's impacted there by the turn lanes in the blue and the orange. And then south of the blue there in the green line, you can see there was a widening section that's outside of the influence area of the intersection. The little stubbies that are coming off the main widening are little sections of roadway that are captured to get the appropriate crashes that are coded to that crossroad route ID, so that all the crashes are considered along the corridor from our roadway inventory. And so that first step allowed us to look at the appropriate CMF and also the improvement type and the crashes that would be associated with that. Then we were able to take that information and enter it into what we're calling a master spreadsheet for scoring. And all of those sub-segments, as you can see here, this one had sub-segments A through S added to it. And then the information was retrieved from our online geospatial crash database to retrieve the begin and end mile points, the AADTs, and thus the VMT to calculate crash rates, and the crashes by the CABCO scale, so that we could pull out those K and A, the fatality and severe injury crashes, in order to develop our Safety 1 and Safety 2 measures of reductions in the frequency and in the rate for those. You can see across the bottom of this spreadsheet capture here that there's a sheet for existing alignment, transit, and travel demand management type projects that would occur on an existing alignment. There's also a methodology developed for new alignments that involves using travel demand models, and also another sheet there for rail freight type projects, which are scored based on reduction in truck trips due to rail freight improvements. But that's a discussion for another day. So we have a different sheet for each project type, and we have a different row for each segment. So just as an example, we could have a project like I showed you in the segmentation that was primarily a roadway widening project, where we would look at the CMF for that, going from 2 to 4 lanes divided in an urban versus rural situation, and develop the reductions in our Safety 1 and Safety 2 factors there that you can see. What we're calling project avoided or projects reduced by that improvement. However, within that project, or at the end of the project, like in the map that I was showing you, they could have called for installing a roundabout. And so that would be segmented out, which has a very nice CMF of reducing those conflict points and speed. And so for severe crashes with a CMF of 0.2, we get a very steep reduction, and reduce those crashes that could occur at that intersection. So summing those all up over all the segments in the project, we could see that they're, how relatively those projects would reduce the severe injuries and the severe injury rate. Now, all of those projects then would be sort ranked based on those two measures, and everything is relative for all of the scores for all of our factors. And so the one with the highest reduction in each of those two safety measures would essentially get a score of 100, down to those that had no reduction or no severe crashes that were identified would essentially get a score of 0 for those two safety factors. And that would be added into all of the other factors to help us identify the priorities for those improvements. If you want to know more about that priority process, about our published CMFs, a lot of what I've presented today is available on the website under the Resources tab that you see here, as well as how we developed and looked at needs based on the VTrans work that was conducted by our Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, and working with our sister agency, Department of Rail and Public Transportation. It's been a pleasure to present this to you from our VDOT perspective. And so with that, I turn it back.
All right, great, thank you, Stephen. Our last speaker today is Mike McNeil from Ohio, and we'll be talking about the benefit cost analysis they do there. So Mike, you should be seeing a message to accept screen control. And there we go, we can see your screen, so please take it away.
Okay, sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is, again, Mike McNeil, and I'm with the Ohio Department of Transportation with the safety program. And so I'm just going to kind of go over today how we use CMFs in our benefit cost analysis and project prioritization. I have an image on the screen here with these two other tools that we use internally here at ODOT that we kind of correlate with the CMF Clearinghouse and how it kind of goes all into our safety application process and whatnot. So just to kind of give you an overview, I'm going to be discussing our ODOT safety application process and how CMFs are used within it, and then kind of expand on that process as to how they're applied, and then how ODOT staff uses it in conjunction with the CMF Clearinghouse. And then I'm going to kind of wrap up with both recommendations for best using the Clearinghouse from our perspective that we found have been good, and as far as countermeasure selection and things of that sort. So just to start, before I dive into the CMFs and how they're integrated in our process, I'm just going to kind of start off from a overview level of our application process. Basically, safety projects are developed one of the three following ways at ODOT. It's basically either on one of our priority lists that are generated annually, sponsored through the district, or sponsored by a local. If a local entity wants to come in, city or county engineer that's looking to do a project, it can be brought upon that way also. And so applications are submitted through the ODOT districts to central office here, and we do have 12 ODOT districts throughout the state. And then at the end of the process, we have a multidisciplinary ODOT safety review committee that kind of reviews all the applications once they're submitted. And the benefit of this committee is it kind of consists of various offices within our central office here to get a full perspective of, the project and what we're looking to go forward with. So it consists of the safety program, both traffic engineering and roadway engineering, and local programs. And so when we're reviewing these things, one of the things that the safety program especially looks at is what's the crash problem out there, the issues and that sort of thing, and does the countermeasure CMF fit the crashes that are occurring out there? So kind of like what's the correlation between the two? So basically that last slide that you just saw, this kind of just puts it in a flow chart for you. So as you kind of go from left to right, the safety locations chosen, be it through the ODOT district or local entity. From there, the crash data is collected and analyzed, and we use one of our tools here at ODOT that's been generated to run that crash data, and we make that tool available to all sorts of agencies, local agencies, and consultants and things like that. Then the countermeasures get selected based on the crashes that are found within the data, and collision diagrams and things like that. Through those, countermeasures become selected. And then it kind of goes into what we call as our ECAT tool. It stands for Economic Crash Analysis Tool, and that kind of is like a full benefit cost tool that brings in the crashes, applies CMFs within that, and then kind of gives us an end result benefit cost so that we can then use those projects to score against each other and that sort of thing, and kind of get a feel for the safety benefit of it. So then between the crash data and the economic crash analysis tool, that safety application then gets submitted, and then that's where the safety committee reviews that application for funding. So in regards to how the location is chosen, we have projects developed the three following ways again. And the first set there is the ODOT priority list. And those are, as you can see there's 3 in the urban category and 3 in the rural. And those are annual priority lists developed through safety analysts. The second way is if it's an ODOT sponsored project. And that would be more like a spot location that might not have been on a priority list, but has an emerging crash trend or something maybe in the past year or two that the district is more or less focused on. And then the third one is the local sponsor that comes in, and that can be a spot location for their interest, maybe a high-ranking crash location on one of their priority lists, whether it be in their local entity or like the MPO. So going from when the location is chosen to pulling the crashes for that location, we use one of our tools here, and it kind of has the same ring to it, but this one we refer to as our GCAT, which is our GIS crash analysis tool. And this is used to query crash data. So anywhere in the state, as you can see there on the screen, how it kind of shows like a circle around the intersection, we can generate crashes for any specific years, specific crash types, anything like that, to be able to pull the crash data, and which we can then use to analyze it. So I've provided an example here. This was an actual location that was submitted a couple years ago, and as you can see here, as the road goes east to west, the major route, you can see the number of crashes there where there was rear ends due to vehicles trying to make that left-hand turn. So this is kind of something that, we pull the crash data. After analyzing it, we can see the trends that develop from it, and then that moves us forward into countermeasure selection. So based on what we see here, what's the best way to address these 57 rear-end crashes that occurred within these 5 years? So I kind of have in the bottom right corner of the screen here a countermeasure that was pulled from the clearinghouse as far as providing a left turn lane on one major road approach. And you can see there that the CMF for that is 0.56, and the one below that is 0.45. And the difference between those two, no difference on the crash type, but as far as the crash severity, the 0.45 is for the fatal and serious injury and minor injury crashes. So that would be the CMF that would be applied for this countermeasure then. So that kind of wraps up the crash analysis and being able to select the countermeasure based on what we see from the crashes. And then moving that forward, our next step is looking at it from a benefit cost perspective. So our economic crash analysis tool imports that crash data that we downloaded from our GCAT run, and it puts it in here, and it calculates the predicted crash frequencies, and it provides a value for the potential for safety improvement. So it kind of does all the background calculations as seen in the HSM. It takes into account crashes, site type, and then provides a net present value of how much the safety benefits are worth for this project. So if you look at the bottom box there on the right-hand side of your screen, where it says net present value of safety benefits, you can see for this project, based on the history of crashes that have occurred there, that it's 1.4 million as far as the net present value for that project. And so we use that number to compare against the countermeasure that we're selecting. So within the red box, you can see our construct left turn lane, and this is where we can enter in the countermeasures then, based on what we want to address the crash problem with. So you can see the service life in there, the initial cost of the countermeasure, and then some annual maintenance depending on depending on what the countermeasure is. That could be in addition, and then a total cost of the countermeasure. So it takes those two numbers, and then the tool has the ability to do the complete benefit cost analysis. So you can see there the net present value of the project versus the net present value of the safety benefits of the project to give us a benefit cost ratio, and what's our investment versus the safety benefit for the crashes that are occurring out there. And the bottom one kind of just shows you the return on investment that's set up. So at year 14 is when we start to see the positive return on the investment based on the safety benefit that is applied out there. So that's just kind of a quick overview of our ECAT tool, but within that tool, we do have a CMF table that kind of goes with the countermeasure selection. So you saw the construct left turn lane that we chose as a countermeasure. Behind the screens, basically, there's the CMFs that are applied towards it. So within the tool, we have a tab dedicated to CMF selection, and everything on there's information obtained from the Highway Safety Manual and the CMF Clearinghouse. And I think we have nearly like 60 preloaded CMFs available on there for selection. And so there's several items in the spreadsheet as far as IDs, the site type, which you can see the 10 different site types off to the right-hand side, countermeasure name, the suggested service life. We also put the star ratings in our spreadsheet, and we typically, like several other states, kind of use the 3-star minimum. And then if our districts or locals are filling out an application and going through this tool, and they don't see one that's on that list, then we do refer them to the clearinghouse where they can reference, several other thousand CMFs if it's not one that we have on there that's commonly used. And that list was built from ones that we've commonly used over the years, and we at ODOT used to use have a rate of return tool before this ECAT tool, and so we kind of just carried that list over also as more commonly used ones that we've dealt with in the past. And so that list continues to be added to, and that's how that's generated. So to go along with that, this is the CMF table that has its own tab in the tool, and I kind of just split it here so that you could kind of see it going from left to right of different attributes that it has within it. So it has all like the site types in the upper photo, and if the countermeasure, which one it applies to. Does it apply to rural multi-lane intersection, freeway segments, like that sort of thing. And then in the bottom one, it kind of carries over. It shows the countermeasure name, suggested service life, intersection related, the star rating with that. And then we have, for each of the countermeasures, the actual name. We have it linked to like the study, the research report that goes with it from the clearinghouse as to where we got it from. And so within the table also, how are the modification factors correctly assigned? So if the CMF states that the crash type, that's kind of what it's based off of, is the crash type. So if it says that it's set up for all crash types, then it has the severity values assigned over here as the modification factors on the right-hand side. Or if it's designed for a specific crash type, then we list out the CABCO scale accordingly for each of the severity levels. So in this screenshot, I've kind of just shown the KA, and then you can see the countermeasure names here. And if you just go off to the right-hand side, you can see, okay, for the first one, change barrier along embankment to less rigid type. You can see that that one is specific to the crash type of fixed object, other object, and that sort of thing, versus ones below it here where it's kind of, it could be universal across the entire crash type. So that's a way that we have them divided up too, just to verify that it's getting applied to exactly what the crashes that it's designed to fix and not coded incorrectly. So after the ECAT tool gets processed, basically the Safety Application Review Committee reviews the applications that get submitted. So after the crashes are submitted, and then it goes into the crash analysis tool, as you just saw with the benefit cost and the countermeasures selected with the CMFs. It goes in for committee review, and these are just several items that are included within that submission. So an electronic copy of the safety engineering study, and then I wanted to show you here that the Excel file analysis that gets brought into these reviews too. So like our CAM tool, which is our crash analysis tool, along with the ECAT tool. So we're getting a full picture of start to finish, looking at the crashes that were generated, then displaying the countermeasures, and then end result looking at the benefit cost, and then also looking at how it scores against the other projects. So kind of just to wrap up, I mean, some of the recommendations that I wanted to kind of conclude with today, and I'm sure a lot of other states are this way too, but one thing that we've really focused on here at ODOT is basing our decisions off of a data-driven process. So it just seemed, the decisions are more effective that way. And by data-driven, I mean, in relation to this discussion, as far as valid research backing the CMFs. So we use the CMF Clearinghouse a lot, whether, it be just to look for countermeasures in general, or to actually use them then in the safety application process. And then right below that I have, as Daniel kind of mentioned this earlier, for those, I'm just trying to get a general feel for the audience. For those not too familiar with like the CMF Clearinghouse and whatnot, just wanted to reiterate that to visit it for reference materials, because they have, I mean, the main function is obviously you're searching for CMFs, but also the user guide that is with that. And I think Daniel mentioned the video tutorials are now available. And then like even just the frequently asked questions. It has a lot of good information on there, and I've kind of provided just a small screenshot down at the bottom, because we get these questions a lot just from the general public when they're going through their process to submit an application. These are a lot of the common questions that get asked anyways, and so they've already been provided on the website, and they provide good links in them and that sort of thing. And I guess the last thing would be to use the performance of the website to assist you in your searches. So, if you're searching for like a CMF in one aspect and nothing seems to be coming up, try and change some keywords or use the filters and whatnot, because there's a lot of information out there in the way that you can find it. So we've found that to be very helpful in the way we've done things. And then I've kind of just provided here, the screenshot you see is the website where we house our economic crash analysis tool. And I have a link provided at the top there. And these presentations will be provided online for you also. But if anyone was curious about, you know, maybe taking a look at this tool, if you wanted to see like how our CMF tab was set up, all the attributes within that, and I mean basically what I had presented on. This is kind of a screenshot of the website then, and I have highlighted in the red circle there that you can download the tool and check it out. And there's a bunch of examples listed below it that we've provided also. So I guess as a follow-up, that's my presentation, and if anyone has any questions, I'll hand it over back to Daniel.
Thanks, Mike, and we like your Chevy Chase CMF here. Thanks for presenting, and we had a lot of good questions come in through the question box, as you mentioned, Mike, about the questions. Just 1 second, let me switch it back over to my screen. We only got a couple of minutes here, so unfortunately I don't have time to go through a lot of these really good questions we got. But what we'll do is, as we've done in past years, we'll give a written response. We'll make a compilation of the questions and our written answers to them and post them with the recording of this webinar, as well as we'll be posting the presentations that each of the speakers have made today. For example, if you want to look at Mike's the ECAT tool, that link that was on there was rather long, so you'll be able to see that later and visit that site. So a lot of good questions there, and Mike, you were definitely the popular one since about the last half of the questions related to your presentation. So I think we're going to have to get together a little bit later so you can give me some good answers to the questions we got. I'll just hit one question that came in that's more of a conceptual thing, because someone asked if you can apply a CMF to observed crashes, which kind of actually gets at, Frank touched on this, we're kind of in a simplified example, just using the past 5, or I think you had 5 or 10 years of crash data or something like that, and you were just sort of demonstrating how you'd apply a CMF to the observed crashes from the past, 5 to 10 years. So certainly you can do that, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you're just looking at a very short time frame, maybe applying a CMF only to the past 2 or 3 years of observed crashes, just be aware, of course, that crash incidence goes up and down, and you might be looking at an unusually high or unusually low incidence of crashes during that time period. So that's a lot of the reason why doing something like a crash prediction modeling SPF type approach like Frank did to get an estimated expected number of crashes for the facility would be a more stable way, maybe give you a more accurate, in a long-term sense, more accurate answer to then apply your CMF to estimate how many crashes you'd expect to prevent. But thank you all for the questions you sent, and we'll certainly get those answered and posted along with this material. So I'm going to hand it back to Karen Scurry to close us out here.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I know we're right at the top of the hour, so if you could just hang on for 2 minutes, because I wanted to review your homework with you. So based on my notes, I have 3 things that we'd like you to do when you leave the webinar today. So the first is you should have received yesterday an email from the CMF Clearinghouse that had included a link to a survey on the use of crash modification factors. This survey was developed under the NCHRP project for updating CMFs for the Highway Safety Manual, and we're really looking for as much input as we can get on which CMFs should be eligible for the Highway Safety Manual and how they should be presented. So we would encourage you, if you have not already, to either go back to that email, or I'm not sure if you can click the link here on the slide, but to take that survey, take 10 to 12 minutes and provide your input so that you can help shape the future of CMFs and the Highway Safety Manual. The second homework assignment was that when you exit the webinar today, remember that a brief survey will load. We would very much appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and just provide feedback on our performance. And then lastly, don't forget that you will receive a follow-up email to today's webinar, and this email will include a link so that you can get your certificate for 1.5 hours of professional development instruction, and you are able to forward that email to the other attendees at your site so that they can download and print the certificate for themselves as well. And then lastly, I would just like to thank our presenters for their great presentations. It's always great to hear how the states are using CMFs and the CMF Clearinghouse. I'd also like to thank Patty and Caroline for all of their help behind the scenes to make today's event a success. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us and learn more about CMF. I hope that you'll visit us again at the cmfclearinghouse.org and take advantage of all the resources that Daniel showed you and Mike gave us props for, so thank you for that, Mike, and more that the site has to offer. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a safe and happy holiday.